Hi, I'm Ms. Hottie from Olympian High School. We'll be using the Traditions and Encounters textbook to study Greek family and society, ancient Greek family and society, starting in chapter 10 on page 248. So find the heading that says Family and Society. The first paragraph in this section is describing to you, it's referencing to the vignette. The vignette was the introductory story meant to hook you, and it described to you a little bit about the Greeks as they were described by the two long epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, written by Homer. We don't know very much about Homer. There's all kinds of disagreement about whether who Homer was and what he wrote about. But he did describe the Greeks as being very assertive, but he was more interested in the heroes and the excitement of the war and the Iliad and the return home. This wasn't a description of the more, maybe you could say, boring, humdrum life of everyday people. As historians, we don't want to just focus our attention on the more exciting characters of history. We also want to look at groups of people, and we want to look at all of the groups, or as many of the groups as we can. So not just men, not just warriors, not just political leaders, but also we want to look at families, for example, and how do men and women and work together, and then concepts of gender. What are gender roles? So when we talk about society, we're talking about groups of people. So whether that one of those groups could be the family unit, another group could be, we could describe it as like male and female gender roles, other gender roles. We could look at, whether that society is patriarchal or matriarchal or other. We've talked about that word patriarchal coming from the word pater, which means father, having a more important role in society. We can look at how educated men and women are. We can look at groups like by occupation. We can look at groups, for example, slave groups. How are they treated? And so I'm just pointing out to you the interest in this section is to look beyond the more extravagant, flamboyant characters, as is described in your book, of the fictional work of the Iliad and the Odyssey, into more everyday lives of people. So, by the way, I've linked in your teacher-created videos a link to Crash Course about the story of the Odyssey. So the two most famous works of Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey. You can learn about the Odyssey there. And on your own, you can always study different topics. For example, today I'll be mentioning about the Scythians, which aren't often described in history. So you could find people who talk about the Scythians and watch a little bit of their talks. For example, here.
The great Greek historians in the 4th century BC said that the Scythians, along with the Celts, were one of the 4 great peoples of the world.
And then you can go on and study this, and this man describes some of the tattoos on their bodies and learn a little bit more. Allow yourself to be intellectually curious. Okay, one of our habits of mind at Olympian High School. So, as you can tell by the marginal note, the Greek society was a patriarchal society. And what that largely means is that women played less of a public role. Men had more authority in the public sphere. So they were more in charge of, say, like government and political issues. And we can see that in many ways. So we can also compare this to other societies that we've looked at. For example, the urban societies of Southwest Asia, so the Middle East. So it's a similarity. Men had the right to decide even whether or not to keep their own children. They couldn't commit infanticide or kill them, but they could leave the babies out in the wilderness to be eaten by animals or to die because of exposure. So they had the right to basically allow their children to die or live or die. Women spent a lot of their lives in the family home. If they left the home, they often left with a chaperone, someone to make sure they were staying chaste and being safe. Sometimes they wore veils. So just like you might see some Muslim women wearing veils, and we've talked about in the past, veils being a feature of Southwest Asian society, and veils being something that were adopted a long time ago, much earlier than we think of with Islam, So we want to make sure that we understand that also here in the ancient Greek society, women, for modesty's sake, wore veils to discourage the attention of other men. Sometimes women, even though they couldn't own land, they would own or rather operate a small business or, like a food stall If they had a public position, it was that of a priestess. So if you're going to take notes on this, this would be under the social section of your inspect chart, and it could go in any of the different columns that you have. The one exception is Sparta. Remember that Sparta is a state that values athletic prowess, and there they have a belief that athletic women give birth to athletic men who will be strong warriors. So there, Spartan women could walk around town on their own without a chaperone. They could participate in athletic festivals, and sometimes they even took up weapons or arms to protect the police. But even there, men were considered the final authority, and they were the ones that were the authorities in politics. One thing I'd like you to write down is that the experience of upper-class women and lower-class women in the Greek cities differed. Upper-class women were often literate, which means they could read and write, and one of the most famous poets of ancient Greece was a woman named Sappho. We don't know very much about Sappho. We know that she was a prolific writer, so she wrote a lot. She was probably a widow from an aristocratic family. People that didn't like her often accused her of homosexual activity, which is where you get the word lesbos, lesbian from. It comes from her hometown Lesbos, or the word sapphic from her name Sappho. Whether or not it was true or not, still debatable, but she was an incredible poet that was honored by many others. Many other Greek philosophers respected her artistic talent. Very little of her work survives, but in it, it does speak to her strong physical attraction to other women. So you can learn more about her. And this challenges what we think of in terms of gender roles. We want to always look at how, this isn't always a rigid construct. Throughout history, there have been different ways of conceptualizing sexuality. Okay. So know a little bit about Sappho. Most aristocratic families gave little girls some type of education. So make sure you know that the rich could afford to educate their girls. When it comes to how work was differentiated, in more countryside, rural areas, men performed the work outside of the house and women performed the work inside the house, the domestic work, coming from the word domicile or the home. So they might be doing chores around the house, weaving textiles, and women and men both participated often in business. The last big topic regarding society that I want to talk to you about is slavery. And here I really need you to think about the fact that what you've learned about history, say in 7th and 8th grade about slavery, is different than what we're learning about now. So sometimes we are tempted to take what we've learned and impose it onto another society. So let's say I learned that this coffee is really hot, and then I drink another coffee and I'm expecting it to be hot, but maybe that's a kind of coffee that's cold brewed and it's not going to be hot at all. So what I'm basically saying is what you've learned about history from the Atlantic slave trade that you learned about in 7th grade is going to be different than what we learned about slavery in ancient Greece. For example, not all slaves are going to be the same, from the same place. They're not all going to be mistreated. It depends on the temperament or the personality of their owner. So just kind of take a minute to think about, what do I already believe about slavery? And then allow yourself to start fresh. Some of what you know might still apply, and some of it may not apply. So not all of the slaves in the Greek colonies, in the Greek areas, were necessarily oppressed or mistreated. Some did very well and had nice lives, depending on who their owners were able to eventually buy their freedom. Okay, so we want to make a comparison. So like other classical societies, slavery existed as a feature of Greek society as well. They came from different backgrounds. Some people became slaves because they owed money and couldn't pay their debts. Notice that this B is silent. We don't pronounce it. Okay. Some were people that were captured in war, and a lot of people were purchased from slave markets at the Black Sea ports. And many of those people were the semi-nomadic Scythians that I mentioned earlier that normally history books don't mention them very much, but you can learn about them more. They're white-looking people. Potentially originally from Iran, depends on who you talk to about the Scythians and where you learn from. And then from the Egyptians, they also traded African slaves from Nubia that were darker skinned. So just make sure you understand that. As far as Greek law is concerned, slaves were considered the private chattel. So let's look at the word chattel. To be chattel is to be somebody's property. So you don't have any rights. It depends on your owner, how you're treated. The conditions of your life depend on whether or not your owner is kind to you. So someone that has skills might have an easier quality of life. So if you don't have any special skills, you might have to do hard, heavy labor working in mines. If you, were working in the home, you might be working as a domestic servant or a caretaker. If, however, you were educated or had special skills, your owner might regard you as someone that can make them money. Maybe they put you to work in a business and allow you to, make a profit, keep a portion of your earning as an incentive for working hard. And your book gives you an example of a slave named Passion, who started off working in a basic position as a porter, then as a clerk, and then eventually turned himself into a very successful businessman and was able to purchase his freedom and gain citizenship, so gain a position of high status within the Greek city of Athens. Okay, so I hope you learned a little bit more about Greek society and are able to make connections between ancient Greek society and other societies that we've learned about in the past, like ancient Persian culture, Chinese societies, and see some similarities and differences.